Good morning. This is Norma Cowie once more here for Wednesday's Norma Talks. Sometimes when I'm contemplating what am I going to talk about this week, or what topic comes up that I want to maybe look at, I occasionally will get this glimmer either from a client's situation or my own. And that happened to me. I think it was not last Monday's mental mind treatments, but the week before, when I had this realization that I had been blaming my father for something that had happened pretty well my whole life. And even though I'd come to terms with it and spoken to him about it and got it that cleared, I had noticed that I had said this story over three times. Now, you may have heard me say this before, but when you tell a story of your life or a situation three times, it means you're addicted to the story. You're not clear in the story. The story is the story. That's your framework. And I was in the middle of a mind treatment for somebody else. Can't remember what, when, how, whatever. And I had the realization, and I might have said these words then, that I had told the story more than three times. And so even while my mindful mind treatment was carrying on, I had this awareness that came after that I had blamed my father when in fact it was myself that had made a decision based on what he said, based on circumstances and how circumstances had happened. When I look back now, I was only coming on, just turned 15. And that's a long time ago. And what it made me realize is that very often we will blame when we do not accept self-responsibility. It's their fault. And then it reminded me of the old thing we were taught very, very early when we're learning about responsibility, is when then you point the finger, one out there, there's three pointing back, but also the thumb goes up to the heavens or to the higher power. Sometimes we're just not aware of how blame can be not construed for ourselves as blame. And that's because we feel righteous. That's because we feel that we're vindicated or there is a reason why that person did that. But the reality is, if you go deeply down into it, is that you're blaming them. I mean, and I would have said, if someone said, yeah, it was my dad, blah, blah. Now, what's the flip side to that is self-responsibility. I found when I look back over my life, self-responsibility came slowly, bit by bit, as I grew as a human being, as I grew in understanding how we operate or how I operated in life. It's not always easy to assume responsibility, especially self-responsibility about self. Why we act this way, or how come we do this, or how come we do that. And it is so easy to make it somebody else's fault. It took me years to learn to stand up for myself in lots of ways. I had a dominant father. I got married young, wasn't around family, and that probably was a plus, actually, because I had room to be able to develop. In a new country with a new husband who was away a lot at the time. So I had didn't have walls. So I had time. I was also pregnant. So I had a new group of people, and I made friends actually with other people who had come new into Vancouver area. Anyway, what am I getting at is that one matures by more and more assuming responsibility for their self and not blaming somebody else out there because they didn't handle it correctly or whatever. Blame is insidious, I found out. I found as the years went by, and this is why it was really interesting to have a big ha-ha moment at this time in my life, because I thought I'd examined everything and assumed my own responsibility. I was, in fact, really made it a personal, what would you call it, mission to be responsible, accept responsibility for myself and my decisions. And even though I made decisions that I look back, I had to do a whole lot of self-forgiveness for. Oh boy, did I ever. Because we're not perfect. And that's our learning curve often. It's okay to accept that we're not perfect. In whose eyes? In the eyes of the divine, in the eyes of the loving force, we are who we are, and we're loved for it. So we love for our foibles, especially when we're wanting to understand more about how they work. What do those foibles work? How do they outpicture into the world? Because the neat thing about it is, the old saying, what you put out, you get back, is it ripples back. And so, again, the sense of self-responsibility. I'm a little hot-headed at times over the years. I could see where I, would take command and this is how it should be or whatever. And you'd usually meet someone head on. And finally, I began to realize it really didn't matter. It took years for me to learn that. It wasn't like I was like my way or the highway. I used to like to work in groups, find out what they thought, but I would be the head, so I would make the decision. And that's what happens when you run your own company and your own elements of where you're going. Now, let's take a look at the fineness of blame. I was looking through the tarot, actually, and I thought, where does that come up? Where do we point the finger? Where do we say it's their fault? And basically it's about attitude that we have inside. We may carry old hurts. We may carry old woundedness that we have and not really accept responsibility for letting that go. We may shield ourselves from what we imagine will be painful for us, because that is one of the things that we learn early, is how to shield ourselves from emotional hurt, how to shield ourselves from being caught up in a sense of pain, emotional pain. We will do anything not to have emotional pain. And yet true growth comes from feeling that emotional pain and moving through it. In other words, not giving it power, not giving it the sense that it wants or needs or creates. Subtlety. I found that we can be very subtle in saying, well, it's not my fault. This happened and that happened, and I had no control over that. And that's true. A lot happens in our world. And I was just thinking, especially right now, when you don't have too much control in the outside. And it's like, but that's not the point. You have control over how you choose to respond. So how do we choose to respond? Do we do a knee-jerk reaction? Battlefield's up, we'll fight and defend our position. I used to love arguing, which I used to think in my mind was debating. And I think, gee, I wish I had learned to really debate in school. I would have really liked that. And I probably would have been really, really good at it. Except I left school really young. So, really, it's like there was no debating team. But I used to find, and I've had people say to me, even my father said to me, you argue black as white. Well, to me, it was just taking a position. It wasn't like I had a lot invested in the position. It was just, words debating back and forth. But in a way, what it was is basically pushing out what my own responsibility was. It was like I enjoyed the word game, you might say. I remember one time when my husband was a school teacher, I was at a party and I took on a person. Would you believe, arguing about makeup, something that's never been really big in my life. And I had one, if not two or three people come up and said to me, you're brave, And I went, what are you talking about? I was having fun. They said, nobody argues with him because you can't win. I said, it's not about winning. It's about having fun with words. That was a small phase in my life because words became important to me as time went on, and I began to realize the value of a word and the word that you say and the word that you use, and how you need to be, especially in the job that I have of consulting and transforming and educating, you have to be very important about how the words are. But sometimes you have to learn on the other side. Excuse me, I just have to have a drink of water here. Sometimes you have to learn on the other side so that you can correct, so that the words become more positional and aware and have meaning. So what we're talking about here is, how are we using our words? Are we using our words to blame? Are we using our words to point out faults? Are we using our words to support and bring into an alignment differences? That often follows by certain energy. When you say a word, what's the energy behind the word? Does it have a meaning here or there? See, I had a lot of experiences to begin to contemplate and think about when people made comments at me about, you're this, you're that, you're the other, or how come you did this, or how come you did that. And I had to take a look and begin to become aware of sometimes how flippant I could be. I'm not very good at flippancy, actually. I'm too serious. I will admit that. And so I learned that often people will throw blame, and it gets into some other things that I work with about power over, power under, and power with. And I believe I have spoken about that. But it's like there's three positions of power, and very often words and blame go into power over. Let's belittle you and make you less than, often with words, sometimes, of course, with action. But basically, it's the power over has the other person feeling powerless. And that person has a power under. And there's been times in my life where I really never had power. I didn't feel like power over at all for me. But some people do when you begin to understand how interpersonal works. And blame has a part of that power over. You are. Finger often comes up as what I call the dictator place. You are this, you are that. That's not respectful. And we're talking about self-responsibility. The person who is delivering that has no self-responsibility except to push what they don't want onto somebody else. And you, then how do you handle that when that's given to you? Do you take it on? Often in our lives, we have little parts of us that are hidden, and that some certain word can trigger that part that's hidden. And then we either go blame back, now we're into the power game, or we feel little, we feel less than, we crumble. But in a sense of what we want to achieve is to really become aware, and through how we think, going back in time, through our wording on certain things, you'll see where maybe there's still a little element of blame. And to be able to go in and realize you actually are responsible for how you respond. Maybe there was no other way you could respond. Sometimes in some situations I have no issue with that. That was how I responded. I was powerless, you might say. Accept that. I forgive myself for that. But if I am wanting to get back at that person or make them pay in some way, that is not assuming self-responsibility. That is responding to an issue. And therefore, you're not being what we would call coming into wholeness or growth. I committed myself quite early in my life, in the sense of years, to discover who I was. I often have spoken about how I wanted to know how God worked. What was God? What happened after death? Yes, I wanted to discover all those things, but primarily I want to discover who I was. Perhaps I'm still learning about that. Who am I really? Sometimes I'm limited in certain areas, and I go, that's interesting. But I assume responsibility for that. It's my responsibility to be able to say, maybe I'm not as big as I like to think I am. Big-hearted, big-hearted as I'd like to think I am. Or I would like to be. It's an image I have to work with. I find that we need to be able to have and assume responsibility in all areas, and that can be a heavy load to carry. But the thing is, when you are connected to the love source, you don't have to carry that. You just have to be aware of it, because you shift the load and you learn how to work with it and let it go. Self-forgiveness, it was one of the things I wrote about, and I'll probably talk about on Sunday a little bit because it's in my book as coming through, is huge. Because if you cannot forgive yourself, the only thing I found is if you are not connected to the love source, it doesn't mean anything. You can just say the words, oh, I really forgive myself, but you've got to feel the words. You got to feel that connection of being loved so much that you know that you're forgiven, so you can forgive. And it's like recognizing that in the biggest scale, blame disappears. There's no need to blame anybody for anything, because you take self-responsibility of you. You forgive yourself for when you're out of order. I have spent a lot of time forgiving myself for things. I have a mouth that shoots off sometimes. I go, oh, what did I say that for? Oh, well, it's done. Words you can't take back. Okay, I can just do a quick brief thing here. And thought you can change. Easy. That's why we work with thinking. That's why we get you looking at thinking. We're looking at the words that you say, transforming them to what it is that you prefer. You can bring back a thought pretty well. A thought. If you think a same thought all the time, it gets a little more complicated because it's got a lot of energy around it. When you speak a word, it's in stone. It's a vibrational stone. It's a sound. It's not just a thought. Words cannot be brought back, but they can be rectified. It took me years to learn to be able to go and say, I'm sorry. Didn't want to say I'm sorry because that meant I wasn't good enough. And then I had to learn that it's okay to say, I am sorry. Tears in my eyes at the moment, because there's been many situations I've had to humble myself because I was behaving in a self-responsible way. And when I say something that's hurtful to another person, or totally, usually unthinkingly, that's why I tend to think a little more, is that we're not being responsible for who we are. And so therefore, in being responsible, you can also go to that person and say, I'm sorry, I said that, and maybe clarify, got straightened. Do you know that probably 95% of the time, the person doesn't know what I'm talking about? Because it just went by. Maybe it didn't really connect like I thought it did. Or the other times I have had, thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. So it's, again, it's okay wherever any person is, whether they're can accept your apology. That's not what the important thing is. The important thing is that you recognize that you were out of line, that you recognized in some ways you were making that person little to you. Or you that put down, oh boy, did I have to learn a lot about that for many years. Become responsible for yourself and your actions. Become responsible, not because you know all is forgiven. That's not the answer. The answer is that you want to become clear. Now, I'll just give you another little tip that I began to be aware of. How come I have to learn to become clear? Because one day you're going to leave this body and you're going to answer one way or the other for your vibration of who you are on your soul. Not maybe your behaviors, not maybe this or that, but the whole package of you. And I knew that I would need to be able to answer for myself cleanly and clearly to reach the level of vibration that I want to be at. And so I keep working at becoming more of myself, to accept myself of who I am, my craziness, my my love of sharing. Yes, my love of sharing knowledge, wisdom, etc. But it's the same thing is to know that I am responsible for me. The bottom line is you are responsible. And if you find yourself looking at certain segments of your life and it was their fault, they did it, take a look at what decisions you made about that, and you'll see that's what created your world, not what they did, but how you responded. Big subject today, hard sometimes to deal with, but it came up for me, and so therefore I get to talk about it. I wish you well this Wednesday. I wish you well. I will be back on Sunday and again next Monday night for mental mind treatments. They're turning out to be quite insightful, actually, for those of us that come. And remember, you can always send me an email or a text for what you want to have treatment for. In the meantime, thank you again for your subscriptions, your support, your comments. It's sincerely, sincerely appreciated. You have a great day. Bye for now.